Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We're honored to welcome all our guests and members tonight for this conversation with Thyago Nogueira, head of the Contemporary Photography Department at Instituto Moreira Salles in Brazil, on the works of Claudia Andujar that are currently on view at ICA Miami. Welcome, Thyago. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure to have you here. To give you a little bit of background, the exhibition at ICA features 16 photographs of Claudia Andujar, both in color as well as black and white, and they date from Claudia Andujar's first visit to the Yanomami in Brazil from the years 1972 to 1976. And in addition to this exhibition, ICA Miami recently acquired 3 works for its permanent collection. I would like to thank Galeria Vermelho and ICA Miami trustee Daniel Berkowitz for their generous support of these important acquisitions. Tonight's talk is generously supported by ICA Miami's longstanding leadership partner, Cartier. Cartier has been an important supporter of ICA since our founding and is dedicated to excellence across art forms. I want to recognize especially Dorothée Charles, Cultural and Artistic Development Director of Cartier North America, for her inspiration and for facilitating this contact with Thyago Nogueira and actively supporting the efforts to share Andujar's work to larger audiences in concert with the Fondation Cartier. The Fondation Cartier is dedicated to promoting and raising public awareness of contemporary art, based in Paris for more than 30 years and more recently also in Milan in partnership with the Triennale Milano. Since 2003, the Fondation Cartier has worked closely with Claudia Andujar and the Yanomami, so for almost 20 years. In 2020, the Fondation Cartier presented the Claudia Andujar retrospective that was curated by Thyago Nogueira. And this exhibition has subsequently traveled to the Triennale Milano and is now on view at Fundación Mapfre in Barcelona. Claudia Andujar, The Yanomami Struggle, is the largest exhibition dedicated to the work of Claudia Andujar to this date, and it's based on 4 years of research in the artist's archives, reflecting over 5 decades of her work, encompassing her extraordinary contribution to the art of photography, as well as her major role as a human rights activist in defense of the Yanomami. Cartier is also committed to the Yanomami, providing support to protect the rainforest and the people who live in it through Cartier for Nature. Tonight, Thyago Nogueira will share an introduction to Claudia's work with us, followed by a brief conversation between him and myself, and there's also the possibility for a brief Q&A, so if you have any questions, please share them in the chat and we will address them at the end of our conversation. Without further ado, I just want to briefly introduce our guest for tonight, as well as the artist we're talking about. Thyago Nogueira is, as I already said, the head of the Contemporary Photography Department at Instituto Moreira Salles, Brazil, and editor of CUM Photography magazine. He has curated the exhibition Claudia Andujar, The Yanomami Struggle at the Fondation Cartier, as well as the other venues. And also an exhibition about Claudia Andujar in the Place of the Other in 2014, as well as shows for William Eggleston and a group show called Body Against Body, The Dispute of Images from Photography to Live Transmission. Nogueira is now working on a retrospective exhibition with photographer Dedo Moriyama, and he also guest edited an issue of Aperture magazine dedicated to Sao Paulo photography. He has chaired the 2020 Hasselblad Foundation International Award in Photography and organized the Offsite project with Magnum Photos during the 2014 FIFA World Cup in Brazil. Claudia Andujar was born in 1931 in Neuchâtel in Switzerland and lives in Sao Paulo. Growing up in Romania and Switzerland, she immigrated first to the United States in 1946 and then subsequently to Brazil in 1955, where she started working as a photojournalist. Andujar's works are held in many collections, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Instituto Moreira Salles, Museo de Arte de Sao Paulo, Museo de Arte Moderna de Sao Paulo, and the Pinacoteca de Estado de Sao Paulo. Andujar received 2 John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowships in 1971 and 77, and a Lennon Foundation Cultural Freedom Prize in 2000. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone and screen to Thyago.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks a lot for hosting me here tonight. I'm really honored and happy to be talking about the work of Claudia Andujar, which is one of the greatest Brazilian artists alive today. And it's also a good friend. I've been working with her for many years now, and we became very close. I would also like to thank, Dorothée, who helped us, put together our conversation, and Cartier for supporting the show that we started in Brazil and that is now traveling in Europe, the Yanomami struggle. I would add that after Barcelona, the show will be going to the Barbican in London and to Winterthur in Switzerland. And then hopefully to the US, because as you might know, Claudia has a very important relation to the US. What I thought of doing here was to share a little bit of the background story of Claudia's, upbringing and formation as a photographer, as an artist, to try to point out where the images that are now on the exhibition of ICA stand in terms of her work. Because as you know, Claudia has been working with the Yanomami for the past 5 decades, so she has a very long story. And it was because of that story that I actually approached her with the project of doing an exhibition. Actually, we did 2 exhibitions, one on her early work and the other on specifically on the Yanomami. But I was very curious to understand the images better, to understand what I was seeing, and also to understand the political dimension of her work that I knew was very strong, but I thought that, with the new generations and the new circulation of her work, this part of the story was not being properly told. So this whole project with her started to try to put this, this heads together, the artistic life of Claudia and trajectory also, but the political story behind her work, which not only relates to Claudia, but to Yanomami and to many people that for years invested their time and their life in trying to defend and to protect the Yanomami in Brazil. So I would like to share a little PDF here. Let's see. Yeah, just to understand, the story of Claudia, because I think her biography explains a lot of what she has done and what she has been doing until today. Claudia actually was born in Europe, in Transylvania, in a region in between that was, at times part of Romania and part of Hungary. This is the little Claudine Haas, actually, the name she was born. And she was born to a Jewish family from her father's side and to a Protestant family from her mother's side, originally from Switzerland. She was actually born in Switzerland, but raised in Transylvania. And during World War II, because of her Jewish ancestry, her father's and her father family were taken away, and she was sent to a boarding school. Her father's family was sent to a ghetto, and afterwards they were taken to concentration camps and killed. And Claudia escaped with her mother to Switzerland and stayed there for some years, but then she found an uncle that was living in New York, and she immigrated to New York in 46 and stayed there to live with her uncle. And she spent almost 10 years in New York before really arriving in Brazil in 55 and starting her career in photography. While she was in New York, she started some artistic productions. She painted. She worked also as a translator at the United Nations, but she didn't take a camera before she was in Brazil. And I think it was a very, Claudia always talks about how difficult her childhood was, how difficult the situation in Europe was, how difficult it was for her not to really have a sense of belonging in anywhere. She kept moving. She lost part of her family. and also she had a lot of guilty because she couldn't really do anything to help the situation. Um, when she arrived in Brazil to actually to reunite with her mother, she started to, she took a camera by suggestions of some friends and started to photograph. And I guess she didn't speak Portuguese at that time. And the camera was a very interesting way that she found to connect with people, to try to establish some bonds with the country that she was now living in. And I think it was a really, really important tool for her in an important language for her to develop and to really feel the belonging in a new place. This is Claudia and I working on the exhibition when she was telling me about her. This is a family album. She was telling me about her story. But I thought it was interesting, to look at these Yanomami pictures just to understand a little bit the characteristics of her work that preceded the Yanomami work. Because when I went to Claudia to talk about doing a show, an exhibition, and a long research on the Yanomami um, work, I said, you didn't really, I mean, it was impossible that you arrive at some point and did what you did without having practiced it a lot before and without having, established the basis of your work and of your ethics and of your relations in other works. So I was very interested in also looking at her previous career, which was something she had kind of put apart for many, many years. And we worked together on a show in Brazil to try to trace this early Claudia and the beginning of her, her building as an artist. And so one of the first series that she did in Brazil was called the Brazilian Families, where she asked for Brazilian families of very different nature, a very rich farmer's family and a very simple fisherman's family, to live with them and to experience their routine. She was, of course, trying to understand, the different cultural levels of Brazilian society. And this is a picture of the very traditional farmer's family in Bahia state that was planting cacao. And she also went, to the fisherman family, with a family in a very urban family in São Paulo, and a very Catholic family in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And I thought those series were very interesting because she was, in a way, doing a certain immersive anthropological take. She was diving into a reality and observing that reality and trying to use photography to map that reality. Another very important moment on her trajectory was the work that she did for Realidade magazine, which was an avant-garde magazine in Brazil. And I guess this is where she also established the idea of a narrative and of building a socially engaged work and transmitting that to an audience. She and a group of other American and foreign photographers actually were working at this magazine. This is a series that she did on a so-called spiritual surgeon that was operating people in Brazil and had lines of people waiting for surgery, and she was there to photograph. And another important aspect, I think, of her work that she developed early on was this transcendent and also this very powerful graphic experimentation, a certain freedom, because she came from a tradition of a more documentary photography. She was using a lot of black and white. But at a certain point, she starts to experiment with filters, with superposition of images, with multiple exposures. And she does beautiful series, and this is one of them, based on the soul of the woman. And I guess she was feeling a certain freedom to really experiment on the photographic frame with techniques to really express what she was feeling, or something that really transcended the image and what was being photographed at that time. And I guess this was also an important aspect that Claudia was going to blend together during the Yanomami. Very briefly, when I approached Claudia to research her work on the Yanomami, I was also confused on the trajectory that she had spent working with the Yanomami, how her understanding of the Yanomami changed the way she photographed the Yanomami, and also the different ways that she understood photography and the ethics behind photography when she was doing those works. So proposed to her to actually to reorganize her archive in chronological terms to see if we could really understand a certain trajectory and in a certain change on the images the more she stayed there. And so these are some of the first images you see on Claudia's archive. And they are already very interesting because, as you said, she got a Guggenheim grant and she quit the journalism, which was, you know, her profession at the time, and decided really that she wanted to embark on a long-term project and dedicate her time and or the time that she wanted to one single project. And she went by the recommendation of a friend to Yanomami village that was kind of isolated until then on the Katrimani River, near the Katrimani Basin. And she starts to photograph, and it's very beautiful because even on the, you know, the early images, I think she's not trying to do a direct representation of the you know, of the community and of the people that she starts to meet, but she is already using those techniques, and very simple actually photographic techniques, to try to build something that was beyond what she was actually experiencing and seeing, that I feel that she wanted to represent something more than just what she was, you know, seeing. And so in these first images, for instance, she's spreading Vaseline on the lens of the camera and creating this kind of dreamlike atmosphere. And what I feel is very interesting in Claudia's work is that I think today we have more access to the Yanomami cosmovision and cosmogony, and because of, you know, the publication of a very important book by Davi Kopenawa and co-authored with Bruce Albert. And when you read about their, you know, their understanding of the world, how they see the world and how they understand their lives and their relation to the planet, I feel also that in a certain way, Claudia was trying to create some kind of photographic representation of that. And even if it started very simply, and you see how much more complicated she gets, I feel that she was already trying to give some kind of concrete photographic aspects to things that were abstract, immaterial, or invisible to her eyes. And these are just, you know, regular scenes of people of this village going to hunt. They used to go to very long expeditions when they needed to hunt, to bring food to the house. So she had to go with them, you know, for days walking on the forest and then camp on the forest and photograph, you know, the routine of men hunting and the women staying on. You see the women, they stay on the camps and they're taking care of the game. But it's already, you feel that the images are very strong and very poetic. And one of the goals of also of this project that I worked on, you know, researching her images, was those images in Brazil, some of them are very famous. And I just thought that we needed to know more about the images, that we could try to identify those people and really understand exactly what they were doing. And a big part of the research that I did on her archive was also to bring back those identities, to try to map those people and to really try to connect to very specific activities in their daily lives. And I think this also was only possible because of the new connections that we have with the Yanomami and the stronger circulation that they have now outside of the territory. Claudia went, I mean, in the early 70s, she went back many times to the Yanomami, to the space in Katrimani region, and she started to use, you know, different techniques. In this case, she was using the infrared film, which was very interesting because it was a film used also by the military to survey the ground of the Amazonia, to map the mineral places that could be rich in mineral and to do the exploitation of the Amazonia. But she was, in a way, I feel she was also subverting these techniques by using them to suggest something that was much more oniric, that had a much stronger atmosphere. And then, and of course, and I feel that connected to the things that she was experiencing and learning with the Yanomami. So basically, her work of this period is divided in her experience in the forest, and then some of you sort of enter into the collective house. I think also this is part of, you know, the step that Claudia took in terms of getting intimacy and affinity with her hosts. So, you know, the first picture is more concentrated on the outside space, and then she starts really to enter the space of the house, the intimate space of the Yanomami living. And some of the houses were really big, as you can see here. They, you know, they housed many different families, and this is also a beautiful sequence. I saw one of the pictures on the ICA exhibition, because she's photographing this young man, and I try to preserve here the, you know, the sequence of the negative. So she's photographing this young man lying on a hammock in this very beautiful way, and then she looks at the sky of the house and see all these holes that are, you know, because of the deterioration of the leaves. And then she approaches the person and photographs him on his portrait, sleeping or half with eyes half closed. And it's interesting also that, you know, she takes this images back to São Paulo. You have to imagine that she's working on, you know, the Yanomami. They live in the very north of Brazil, and it's about 4,000 kilometers away from São Paulo. So she photographs for a certain period there. She doesn't know what she's photographing. This is the time of analog photography. And then she takes those images back to São Paulo, develops, and in this case, she rephotographs the images with this purple filter. So I feel the more she enters the collective house, and also the more time she spends with the Yanomami, the more complex her images become, and the more suggestive they become. You really start to see that this is not a photograph of a specific house, but it's representing some kind of atmosphere that is beyond what's being shown on the image. This is also another, you know, image of just a young children looking at Claudia, and he's staring at this white woman, very strange woman, probably for the Yanomami. But you see, you know, how she transforms the ray of lights, and the light that enters the maloca, and also the lights that makes this contour on the children's body into something that's much suggestive. And then reading about, you know, when the Yanomami describes the shapiri, which are the image beings that circulate on the air and that are invoked by the shamans. They refer to them as their children, the small human beings that are circulating on this very bright mirror-like atmosphere, and that they have a very bright outline, and they're bright feathers and etc. I feel that Claudia was also trying, you know, to create some kind of relation with those understandings of the Yanomami culture.
May I interject with one brief question?
Yeah, sure, Stephanie.
This is really interesting. So how long would she stay with the Yanomami at a time? Would she really live with them in their communal houses, or would she stay somewhere else? I feel, as you said, with the families and the Brazilian families she worked with before this project, you can really sense this intimacy and trust between her and the people who are photographed.
Yeah, I think the intimacy was a growing intimacy. I mean, the first trip she makes to the Yanomami region, to the Catrimani specifically, she spends 4 days there, and she's received by an Italian missionary that was living nearby since 1965. And he spoke Yanomami, he knew very well the grounds and etc. And he welcomed her and helped her, you know, to move along. And actually she slept on the mission base. There was a small hut for the mission base. And then she progressively comes back and forth and starts to spend longer periods. I think she's not living inside of the huts with the Yanomami. She's always living in something that's nearby. But of course, I feel that, you know, in the first trips, she goes there and photographs and then come back. but the more she stays there, I mean, she stays 1 month and then 4 months and then 6 months and then until a certain point that she really buys a one-way ticket and has no plan to return, she starts to integrate on the activities, and she starts to she's photographing, but not only, you know, she has other duties. She's helping to do this and that, and she's really working with the community and also with the people that are surrounding the community. You will have, you know, the missionaries, the people from the health, from the state health, and from the federal, the national organization of the indigenous. So there are, these were not, I mean, totally isolated group of indigenous. They had people around, and I feel Claudia was living also around these communities.
Thank you.
I mean, the more she stayed, I think the more complex her pictures become. And this is also one picture that I saw at the ICA exhibition, which is, I feel it's a very important picture because it represents the cocoon of a dead body. This is the way the Yanomami bury their dead people. Actually, it's part of a long ritual and a very important, a central ritual in the Yanomami community that's called Reahu, and it is based on the decease of an important person. So the people is left to dry on the forest in this cocoon, and then when the body decomposes, they take it, they clean the bones, they burn it, they grind the bones, and they consume part of the bones in a porridge during the rituals. And this is the way they homage their deaths, and also the way they can make this deceased body ascend to the sky. And it's very interesting because the Yanomami, in their cosmogony, they have, you know, different levels of sky, but the deceased body goes to the back of the sky where all we call, you know, the souls of the deceased inhabit. And the Reajo is a very, very central ritual in the Yanomami society, and it's held usually once a year. And it's not only a funeral ritual, but also an communitary ritual. It's a ritual where you call your guests and other communities that surround you. Is a ritual where you create couples, where you know make peace with the ones you're fighting with. It's a ritual that can take days and that has a very specific ceremonies inside it. It's also the ritual where the Yanomami inhale the Yakoana pounder, which is the hallucinogenic pounder that help the shamans to speak with their shapiri, the spirits that I was talking about, which are you know spirits that inhabit all the world, and that help the shamans to take decisions, to guide, you know, the community. Also, they are responsible for invoking the powers of nature, the rain, a good harvest, and etc. So it's a very really important ritual. And what I found very interesting in Claudia's work was that how she was using different techniques of photography to photograph each of these rituals. So she was, for instance, in this case, there's a long ceremony where you offer plantain porridge to the guests, and they have to drink and drink and drink, and they cannot refuse. Actually, there's an abundance of food, and she's using this multiple exposure, you can see, to recreate this idea of repetition and abundance. Or these images that are from the women's ritual, the women's chant, where they chant and chant together, only the women's also trying to create connections with the shapiris, and you know, discussing things, for instance, about the harvesting. This is another part of the ritual called Yaimu, where I think one day I was talking to David Copenau, and he said, this is like the radio that you use. You know, it's when we hug each other and we transmit the news and we say things to each other all the time, and we bring news from other communities and etc. So it's very interesting because he compared that to a radio. And of course, this was an original black and white image that Claudia rephotographed in with filter afterwards. This is also some images of the Reajo feast, where Claudia was using other kinds of experimentation, in this case, shaking the camera with lights and oil lamps to create these streaks of lights. And I just thought it was also important to show a little bit of the Catrimani region, because I'm not sure all the people are familiar with where they are. And actually, I must say, even when we opened, this big exhibition in Brazil that's now touring, I realized how few people in Brazil really know about the Yanomami. There was a lot of feedback and people talking about, thanking the exhibition for telling them about the Yanomami, teaching them about the Yanomami, and creating some kind of empathy and connection to the Yanomami people. So they are here in the north of Brazil, and this is in red. This is now the demarcated Yanomami territory. And you see here, I don't know if you're seeing my cursor, but you see here, Catrimani, this is the place where Claudia was working. This is, this land here is the size of 2 Switzerlands. So it's a really big area. And this is where Claudia was working. And this is the whole community, which she didn't know at that time. And actually, she discovered that much later when she really went into the political and activist project. So what it's important here to understand is that I think for these first 6 or 7 years that Claudia really decided, to live there and learn about the Yanomami and create some kind of relation. She in many writings and audios, she's saying, this is my land. I want to stay here. I want to live here. This is my family. She's trying to create this kind of photographic universe to represent what she's understanding of a community, of an indigenous community that she's in touch and learning about, which is a very different situation from what happens in the next years, where this community starts to really be managed by what we call the development of the Amazon, with the public investments on roads and on mining and all these tragic and very violent program of development that starts to menace the Yanomami and bring the epidemics and bring alcohol, prostitution, and many things that are a big destructuration of the society. And then Claudia actually starts to denounce that at that time, and she's expelled from the Yanomami land. And she has to stay in São Paulo for almost a year, trying to go back, and she can. And this is, I feel that's a very interesting turning point, one of the turning points on her story, because she kind of starts to move away from this more artistic and aesthetic interpretation of the Yanomami, and really starts to get closer to the activists and people that were really worried with indigenous rights in Brazil. So she creates an NGO, and then when she's finally back to the Yanomami land, she is already there as an activist, not as a photographer anymore, and she's producing images only to instrumentalize her actions and her, the problems, and to denounce and to bring out of the Yanomami land the information about the violence to try to stop that. So these are also, I feel there is a change in the, let's say, also on the ethics of this imagery, because they are images that need to call attention, that need to protect people. And this is, what she dedicated herself for many years. I'm not going to go into much detail of that part. This is a very complex political intertwining of photography, art, and politics. But it's just to give an idea of also how her images circulated, not on, on the realms of museums or galleries and etc., but they were really being produced to inform the anthropological associations. And then in the case, for instance, you may know the series Marcado is a very important series of Claudia, done many years later, but in this case, they were used for a vaccination campaign that they started in the 80s on the Yanomami land. And just to conclude this changing also of perspective of photography, because this is, I think, one of the most fascinating things I've learned while researching Claudia's story and archive also. There is another moment where she has stopped photograph, and they need to press for the demarcation of the Yanomami, and there's they are involved in many NGOs and international support and etc. and they do a protest exhibition in Brazil with the NGOs to try to press for that demarcation. And Claudia decides to rephotograph her whole archive of the Yanomami and create an audiovisual projection. I'm just showing some of the images here, but this is actually a big installation that she's doing where she's really reusing the archive as a tool for the political visibility of the Yanomami, and to explain to people what we are doing to them, and to try to stop the violence and revert actually the problem of the demarcation. And so, just before we conclude, and also to discuss a little bit, more specifically the work and the question and answers. This is just an example of when we opened the exhibition in Brazil. It's interesting to say that this was a whole project that was created much before we had Bolsonaro as a president of Brazil, and much before we had, the pandemics and COVID as a menace all over the world. And we opened in Brazil in 2018, and then it went to Fondation Cartier right before the pandemic started. We opened in end of January, beginning of February, and the pandemic started in March, 1.5 years ago, 1 year ago. So it was also interesting to see, how the meaning of Claudia's images also change with the situation that we are now facing, not only in Brazil, but all over the world. And I think this is the most, important and interesting contribution to Claudia, her, changing and her changing understanding of photography, and her use of the archive and of the images as something that is a political weapon to press for rights and to work in favor of groups and of indigenous groups. That's her, editing some of the works that we have now at ICA and at Fundación MAPFRE in Barcelona. But I think this is, a small overview, I had to jump things because of time, but I think it gives a little bit, kind of an outline of the complexity also of Claudia's artistic project and career and involvement with activism and her relation to the Yanomami.
Thank you so much, Thyago. This is really fantastic and a wonderful dive through so many interesting parts of her work. I am going to share my screen to show also the exhibition at ICA for anybody who hasn't seen it. So these are the 16 works, and you've already talked about the work here in the center, which is the Reau, the fernery urn. And I would like to ask you a more specific question about some of the other images. One of them is actually, we've seen this, this was recently acquired for our collection, which is a really powerful image, and the screen really doesn't do justice to the really fantastic colors of these works. So I actually wanted to start talking about this piece, which is from a series called The Forest. So a lot of the photographs, as you had mentioned, are actually divided into different series that also give more specific information on the culture. So there's the forest, the house, the reau, and the consequences of contact. And I wanted to take this example from the forest series that, as you mentioned, uses the infrared film, so has this really intense colors. And I was hoping you could talk more about this image and its context.
Yeah. Yeah, so this image is part of the forest series. Is an image that Claudia took of Roraima, probably from an airplane. And she was using, as I said, the infrared film, which I felt it was very interesting because at the time, the Brazilian government was discussing the idea of mapping the Amazonia forest with infrared film. They had just developed an airplane that could fly all over a certain strip of the Amazonia and try to map it for projects to search for minerals, to start the exploitation programs that started during dictatorship in 1971. And I feel that it's really interesting that Claudia was using the scientific, let's say military technology from photography, and in a way subverting that technology to try to suggest something much different, I guess. Um, I'm not an anthropologist, and the Yanomami, I had to study a lot of the Yanomami story and cosmovision because of the exhibition, but actually came in from the curatorial and the photographic side. But when I was reading, Davi Kopenhauer's book, The Falling of the Sky, and he talks a lot about, the concept of Urihi, which is the land forest where the Yanomami live, which is very different from our idea of forest because they don't separate, the forest as something different from the humans that you can really exploit and you can really, use to the point of exhaustion. They need the integration of the forest for them to survive, and they feel they are part of that ecosystem of forest, and not only of the forest but of things that we don't see. They have spiritual beings for the for the winds, for the rain, for every, of course, for every tree, and for the storms. And I feel that maybe Claudia was trying to approach some kind of representation of that, complexities of the Yanomami way of looking. The Shapiri, as I said, are responsible also. The circulation on the air is responsible for the freshness, to keep the freshness of the forest. And so when I look at this image, I always think of those things that I learned from Davi's words. I also feel it's a very interesting image now to think about climate change, and also all these discussions on the on the heating of the forest and also the climate change, because I feel this is something I've seen with the circulation of Claudia's exhibition in Europe also. There's a big discussion on climate heating and the deforestation on the forest. And I feel that sometimes we miss the idea that these forests, they are inhabited by people, by many people. Actually, they seem like this vast green empty continent, but they are inhabited by many people that have preserved those forests. And they are not a picture of wilderness, but you could think of them as a kind of a garden where the indigenous populations have been planting and cultivating and circulating. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but the Yanomami, they are semi-nomadic people. So they need, an entire piece of forest to circulate for the hunt to regenerate, for the trees to regenerate, for the rivers to be, the springs of the rivers to bring clear water for the fishes and etc. And I think this is, in a way, I feel these images summarize all the idea of the urihi and this integration and this equilibrium that we tend to overlook on the forest. But also for me, it points out to this idea of, not overlooking the indigenous populations that live there, because they are the ones that can really understand the forest and find ways to preserve those forests.
Thank you. You mentioned Davi Kopenhauer, who we also saw in one of the images you shared on the panel of the exhibition. Could you just share a little bit more about who he is and how he's involved in the project?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to mention that this research project that generated the exhibition was a long process that involved many people, anthropologists. I mean, I started with photography, and I started to pull a little string, and actually it was very ambitious to talk about all these subjects. And I had to bring into the exhibition many other people to help me to understand Claudia's images, because they were connected in a way or another. And part of the I think the interesting part of this research was to have the involvement of the Yanomami themselves, helping me to understand those pictures, helping me to identify the people that were portrayed and etc. And Davi Kopenhauer is the main leader, let's say, of the Yanomami, especially of the Yanomami that are in the part of the Yanomami lands that Claudia is working, because you have more than 300 different communities of Yanomami people living in Brazil with 5 different languages, and they have, you know, even different habits, culture, and etc. So Davi Copenau is part of this region where Claudia was working, and he became a very good friend of Claudia. And actually, during the 80s, when they had to really fight against, you know, the economic greed of the Brazilian state, but also of the private companies that started to press for the development of the Amazon. He traveled all over the world with Claudia. He was really responsible to speak out and to share the vision of his people. And Davi is a very, very smart thinker, because he really can incorporate on his discourses, and even on his his mythology and a cosmovision, the problems that we are generating on the Yanomami land. So he's really, you know, connecting the idea of, for instance, the falling of the sky, which is the title of the book, which is a very important idea for the Yanomami, because the origin of the earth was when a very old sky has fallen and has killed everything that was here, or made everything go to the underneath and started a new, you know, civilization. This is when the Yanomami flourish. And he's always saying that if we continue, you know, to explore the land and the Amazonia and the forest the way we do, with mining, with, you know, deforestation, with logging, etc., the land will be sick, and thus the Shapiris will also be sick, and they will not be able to help the shamans to hold the sky up high, and the sky will fall again. So it's very interesting also looking back at this image, you know, how all this idea of the different skies of the Yanomami that we can understand from their vision of the world is also present here. But yeah, I mean, Davi is the main leader of the and spokesperson of the Yanomami. He's a very big partner of the exhibition, and together with his son, they are doing a very important job, you know, to speak out, not only uh, as they did in the 80s, but now with all the invasion of, you know, illegal miners again in the land, and also the arrival of COVID and etc. He's been the main person and that has been able to speak out about the problems of the Yanomami and defend. And I think it's interesting to mention also that, you know, part of Claudia's project, I think she understood that uh, her project involves using her images to open space for the Yanomami to speak out. So I think one of the main, you know, goals of her is really to use the opportunity of the exhibitions and the insertion that she has on the museums and on the art galleries, etc., but also in a more wider scenario to bring Davi and to bring other people and really give the grounds to them for them to say what they want and to put, you know, their agenda and to denounce what's going on in their land.
Thank you. I think that is also a really important point that connects to the seriousness, the consequences of contact. You were speaking about all the negative effects that this invasion in the territories of the Yanomami has, and this is actually a very strong image and portrait of a young man who's a measles victim and who's treated by shamans as well as paramedics at the Catholic mission that you mentioned in the Katrimani region. And maybe you can speak more to this image.
Yeah, well, this is, yeah, Claudia is using infrared film again here. It's a very, you know, seductive pink color. It changes the green to pink. But actually what we see here is, you know, this certain superposition of things, because the Yanomami, when they start to build, you know, the Perimetral Norte, at a certain point, the Brazilian government decides to build a big road that crosses the Yanomami territory. And with this, they brought in many workers and, you know, road constructors. And also they brought in epidemics. So in this case, they brought measles, which are diseases that the Yanomami didn't know how to care. You know, the shamans during the Reahu, they can take care of many diseases, but the diseases that come from the white and non-indigenous populations, they the shamans feel helpless. And in this picture, there is a shaman trying to take care of this young man from Wakatau community, but actually they are having to take care of him also with the paramedics, we call it, with the doctor from the Catholic mission that was trying to help, to save this man. But I think the image speaks a lot about, this massive arrival of diseases that actually our contact with them, the unprotected contact with the Yanomami generated. And actually Claudia speaks a lot about, entire communities of people completely devastated by measles. They arrive at a certain community and they see 60 people, some of them dead and the others trying to take care of their deads, but they also becoming ill. So it's a very, very kind of apocalyptic and tragic scenario that they are facing at this moment because of our contact. And I found it very powerful to see these and then to think again of what's going on with us now with COVID and all these, the pandemics where we're, trying to help each other and feeling also helpless.
Yeah, I think that was also one of my questions that I noted. Just if you could, there's obviously a lot of continued urgency in Claudia Andujar's work, I feel, and I wanted to see if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
current situation with the COVID-19 crisis, and also, I mean, you mentioned briefly in the 90s, it really turned more to political activism, and Claudia Andujar actually helped reach a lot of important milestones. But how does this continue, this work of hers, and what is the continued urgency?
Yeah, I mean, I think for all this generation, what we're living today is a kind of a nightmare because they've been through this and they have fought, for many years against this. They have given everything they could. And, actually they were partially successful in 92 when they got the demarcation of the Yanomami territory as a continuous piece of land. But of course, we couldn't imagine that Bolsonaro was going to be elected in Brazil, and the same kind of, discourse against indigenous populations, the same kind of prejudice, the same kind of idea of, integration and economic development, meaning economic destruction, was going to be implemented by the Brazilian government. And so everything just, turned upside down because all the problems that we thought we had overcome during those past decades, they just came back with stronger force, with the support of the government, but also with the COVID pandemics because of there is a lot of illegal miners working on the Yanomami land now because of the lack of fiscalization from the Brazilian government to really use money to take them out of the land. And these illegal miners, they not only pollute the rivers, they not only bring mercury to the rivers and poison people and also the fish and the hunt, but they bring COVID to the Yanomami land. And you saw the extension of the land, the complexity of taking care of people inside of their land and how helpless the shamans are in terms of fighting diseases that are brought in by our society. So it's really they're right now living a very dramatic situation because they have to start a fight again. And there's been a lot of mobilization. I think Claudia's work has been helping, but there is a lot of agencies that are connected to this. The Yanomami themselves, they have the Hotukara Association. There is a group of anthropologists and indigenous people also working on, mapping the introduction of COVID and the extension of damage. They released a campaign that was called Out Miners, Out COVID. They got 400,000 signatures, but it's just an endless and very hard fight because of the the scale of the land, the complexity of the health system and the political system. So they are, Davi is really having to travel again to talk about, the violence that's happening right now at the Yanomami land. And I think also what's very cruel is that, COVID is taking away some of the elderly from the land as it is in our society. And the elderly in the Yanomami society are the people that really hold, the knowledge that really guides, can organize society. They are the shamans, they've been trained for so many years to be the central core of the society and the organization of the society. And they know how to cure, they know how to talk to the spirits. They really understand an entire vision of the world that is disappearing with the killing, of these people. So it's really, really, I mean, it's a really real terrible moment in Brazil right now, not only in the cities but also on the forests, because we keep on underestimating and overseeing the indigenous populations. And this is not, only about the Yanomami. As you may know, we have more than 300 different indigenous people in Brazil. So it's about, the lack of care that these people have been subjected to, since many years. They've been exterminated since colonization of America, but also since dictatorship. They're really, really hard fighters, but it's not been an easy scenario.
Thank you for sharing this. And I stopped sharing my screen briefly. We're already at 8 o'clock, but I think we'll have time for maybe one question from the audience that kind of connects to what you were just talking about. And the person asks if Claudia is still actively working with the Yanomami as of now.
Yes, definitely. I mean, since 1971, when she did the first trip to the Yanomami, because of her Guggenheim grant, she has not, stopped to work with the Yanomami for, a single day. I mean, she's absolutely dedicated to that cause. She's absolutely involved. And, as I tried to explain a little bit, how her activity changed and turned and in a way moved away from arts into political, very strong political activism. She was for many years writing telegrams, organizing protests, campaigns, and etc. It was not very easy for a woman to be working with this within this scenario. But especially Claudia and David, they became like, a couple partners, and they speak very often, and she's always, trying to help with her imagery and with whatever she can to improve the rights of the Yanomami. I think, Claudia's story also is a story of, connecting this to her past in Europe. She's, her family story is the story of violence, of a killing, of something that she was not able to help because she was just a child. And I think she spent her life trying to understand, why we are violent as we are, and also how vulnerable we are. And I think those connections led her to the Yanomami, and also, created in her kind of a very strong ethics that she puts in front of everything, and that yields this strong commitment to defend people that are being marginalized, oppressed, discriminated. So, yeah, I mean, Claudia is old now. She's 80. She will turn 90 this year, but she's, every single day of her life taking care of the Yanomami, not only with her art, but in very practical terms, discussing, implementing other kinds of programs, and doing whatever she can to help.
Thank you, Thyago. I think this might be a really good closing point to our conversation. And thank you again for sharing all this with us. There The exhibition at ICA Miami is still up, and there's also a wonderful, very comprehensive catalog edited by Thyago on the exhibition, The Yanomami Struggle. And there's also the book by Dawi Kopenawa, The Falling Sky, that I also highly recommend.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. I'm glad, of your interest in Claudia's work. And yeah, I hope we can also bring, the full exhibition to the US. And I wish Claudia was here with us tonight, but I hope I have done some justice to, some of her ideas and understandings of art.
Thank you again so much, and thank you for everyone joining us tonight.